I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from the ongoing Leopard II tank saga as hopes rise of a breakthrough in deliveries of the vehicles. We hear from foreign correspondent Colin Freeman, who's been speaking to Ukrainian activists tearing down Russian statues, and Francis Dearnley speaks to Dr Ivana Stradner, an expert in Russia's propaganda warfare, to examine how the West can fight back against Putin's disinformation, not just in the English-speaking world, but in Ukraine, Africa and the Balkans.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 24th of January, day 335. And with me to discuss the most recent events in Ukraine and around the world, I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nichols, our assistant foreign editor Venetia Rainey, and foreign correspondent Colin Freeman. I started by asking Venetia for the latest from the Telegraph's foreign desk.
So there's a really big story that's literally evolving as we speak, and it's the biggest shake-up against corruption in Ukraine since the start of the war. Corruption is a long-standing problem for Ukraine. I think in 2021 they were ranked 122 out of 180 countries. So this is not something new, but of course there is a lot more at stake now that the West is helping with billions of dollars of aid and weapons, and now that Ukraine wants to join the EU. So we've seen the governors of 5 provinces on the front line resign today in Kyiv, Sumy, Dnipro, Kherson and Zaporizhia. And we've also seen a host of quite high-profile officials resign or, be pushed out, including the Deputy Defence Minister, the Deputy General Prosecutor and the Deputy Head of Zelensky's office, along with a bunch of other ministers. Now, most of these are linked to corruption allegations, although not all of them. I'll give you a few examples to give you an idea of the kinds of things that have been riling people up in Ukraine. So the Deputy Prosecutor General, Alexei Simonenko, he took Christmas holidays in Spain and was pictured, sort of enjoying that holiday while everyone else was suffering through a cold winter in Ukraine. The deputy head of Zelensky's office, Kirill Tymoshenko, he's been implicated in a scandal over his use of luxury cars, pictured driving a Porsche around, and questions over where he's got those cars from. And then the deputy defence minister, Vyacheslav Shapovalov, he allegedly brought military food supplies at inflated prices. So it just gives you an idea of the different sorts of corruption that are ongoing in Ukraine, or sort of allegations around corruption. And some of it is about how bad it looks. Obviously, if people in Ukraine are suffering through a terrible winter while Putin is bombing cities and energy infrastructure, you don't want to see officials on holiday in Spain. And some of it is just really poor form, buying food supplies at higher prices when the country is already struggling economically and having to borrow lots of money. It's just bad economics. So, Zelensky has said that he's trying to crack down on this. His aide has said that his decisions show that the president sees and hears society and that he's directly responding to the key public demand of justice for all. We have had a few purges in Ukraine so far to sort of try to tackle corruption. One was in the spy agency back in July. And we've also seen a sort of ongoing crackdown on people who might be sort of saboteurs or turncoats in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that's been sort of ongoing over winter. So it's clearly something that is important to Zelensky. He wants to show that he's on top of this issue, and that he's not just sort of letting the country take for granted all the assistance that it's been getting.
Absolutely. I mean, it brings to mind what Roland was saying yesterday on yesterday's podcast about it. Maybe there's a feeling now in Ukraine that politics is the moratorium of political combat is potentially over with Zelensky's moves against corruption. Thanks for that, Venetia. Are there any other updates from you before we head to Dom to talk about tanks?
Well, yeah, just sort of give the news lines around on tanks today. Obviously, it's an issue that you guys have been crunching over in the last few podcasts. But today we heard that the German Defence Minister said that, training can begin. They're still waiting for the official sign-off. Poland has sent its request to Berlin now to authorise the green light for it to send its tanks to Ukraine. But I'll let Dom get into the nitty-gritty of all those details more shortly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much, Venetia. It's really good to hear you again. Dom Nichols, can I turn to you? What's been at the top of your inbox this morning?
Well, hi, David, and hi, everybody. So, a bit of tanks first, shall we? So, the latest thing. So, a senior unnamed Ukrainian official told ABC News in the States of a deal made last Friday at the Ramstein meeting. Now, we remember that Alexei Reznikov, after the meeting last Friday, he said he was very satisfied with the outcome, which was the correct and polite thing and the politic thing to say. We were all hoping that there'd be some movement on the Leopard II tanks, but there wasn't. So, Reznikov says that, and we all go, yeah, okay, fine. That's he's got to say that. However, ABC News is saying that that on this deal that was made last Friday, Ukraine are going to receive 100 Leopard II tanks from 12 countries once Germany gives the green light. There was an agreement thrashed out last week. So the likes of Poland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain are said to be all reportedly willing to send some of their tanks once that consent is given. As Ivana just said, so Boris Pistorius, the German defence minister, he's told broadcaster ZDF, he said, I'm preparing for a possible decision to send the Leopard tanks and to allow other European and NATO partners to do the same. If the decision takes 1 or 2 days, and that's just the way it is, so fine, okay, 2 days. However, a touch of cold water here. That's not quite what Olaf Scholz is saying. Last night, he overruled his foreign minister to insist that Poland would need to follow the rules over sending tanks to Ukraine. Poland said that they could just do their own thing and send them. Olaf Scholz kind of holding onto the party line. The Polish Prime Minister, in response to that, has said he wants a quick response from Germany because they have now formally submitted an official request to send their tanks. And Mateusz Morawiecki has said, I hope that the answer from Germany will come quickly because the Germans are delaying, dodging, acting in a way that is difficult to understand. We can see that they do not want to help Ukraine defend itself in a wider way. Okay, right, let's just pause and take stock here because that's some quite strong language there from Mr. Morawiecki. I think he's saying Germans dodging, delaying. I think that's they're delaying, possibly dodging, I don't know, acting in a way that's difficult to understand. I disagree with. It is. You could see why a lot of people say, well, they should just be sending the tanks. However, to say that it's difficult to understand why they're not is to misunderstand German politics. And we've thrashed out in the last few days some thoughts on internal German politics and the position of Chancellor Scholz's his party, the SPD, and the coalition he leads with the Liberals and the Greens. So, there's some difficult politics there, which we've tried to unpick. And I think we've done a fairly reasonable job of coming up with some analysis there. So I don't think it's fair to say it's difficult to understand. And then the comment, we can see that they do not want to help Ukraine defend itself in a wider way. No, sorry. I think that's a heat of the moment bit. Heat of the moment statement there when we look at what else Germany has done in terms of Gepards, Iris-T, Marder, and so on, and put it together with humanitarian aid and economic aid. All told, Germany is second after the United States. Forget the aid that Russia's been sending and gifting other military equipment, but Germany is second to the US when you put the whole package together: military aid, money, and humanitarian aid. So I just want to put this in perspective. I've been bashing Germany. A lot of people have been bashing Germany. That is not to bash the country. That is to bash the decision not to allow other countries who are prepared to send their Leopard II tanks. We've just got to pass the two, and I don't think those comments are particularly helpful there from the Polish Prime Minister. Now, also going on today, NATO Sec Gen Jens Stoltenberg is hosting Boris Pistorius, Germany's defence minister, today. Did a press conference earlier on. Mr. Stoltenberg kind of made the same point I've just been making there, just trying to temper enthusiasms a little. He said, Germany plays a key role in our alliance. The Zeitenwende, remember that was announced early last year. That's the kind of epochal, once-in-a-generation shift in foreign policy that Chancellor Scholz said. He said. So Jens Stoltenberg carried on. The Zeitenwende announced by Chancellor Scholz is historic, with a special 100 billion euro defence fund. That's Germany alone. 100 billion euro defence fund for fifth-generation aircraft, new helicopters, ships, tanks and ammunition. You are already one of the biggest troop contributors to NATO's missions and operations. You lead NATO's forces in Lithuania. Your jets patrol Allied skies, and 15,000 German troops are committed to NATO's rapid response forces. This significantly contributes to strengthen our deterrence and defence. Unquote. The point here is that Russia are looking for any way to say that there's a fracture in the Western Alliance, there's a fracture in NATO, there's areas to be exploited here. They don't say, actually, these discussions, these decisions, these thoughts and ideas out in public, that's what a healthy democratic institution can do, and grown-ups can talk about these things in public and disagree, but still be friends at the end of it. But it's important just to make both these points, I think. So responding specifically about a question on tanks that was put to him at the press conference, Jens Stoltenberg carried on. He said, I welcome also the clear message from the minister that our other allies, other NATO allies that have Leopard battle tanks are, of course, free to identify those Leopard battle tanks that may be available to Ukraine, to make them ready, but also to start training of Ukrainian crews for those battle tanks. Because after the decision has been taken on delivery of tanks, it will take some time to identify, to make ready, and to train Ukrainian crews. And I welcome the clear message from Minister Pistorius that allies with Leopard battle tanks are actually urged to start that work. Germany is one of the allies that are providing the most support when it comes to artillery ammunition, advanced air defence systems, the Gepards, the RST, and also now heavy infantry fighting vehicles, the Marders. These are important armoured capabilities that significantly strengthen the combat capability of Ukraine. We need to remember and recognise these significant German contributions. End of Jens Stoltenberg's quote. And yeah, I think that's right. We are grown-ups here. Yeah, we're able to hold two ideas in our heads at one time. That yes, Germany is making a massive contribution, but also at the same time, Germany, we're looking to you for leadership here. You want to be a big leader in Europe. This whole idea of European sovereignty doesn't sit well with then having to look to the US for permissions and so on and so forth. So I think we are, as adults, able to put both these ideas together and discuss them without having the Russophiles piling and go, told you, NATO is fracturing. It's not that at all. We can discuss these things in the open, and it doesn't mean that we're turning our back on Germany. But there is a legitimate question here that is still flowing around. And I will take a pause there before we dig into what are tanks.
Thank you very much, Dom. Yeah, I've got one question for you just before we go into that, but just very quickly, I think we're having some technical issues on this space in terms of getting our wonderful guest Colin Freeman on. So Colin, if you can hear us, I think my suggestion would be if you drop out of the space at the moment and then rejoin via the invite link that the main Telegraph account would have sent you, you should be able to join as a speaker through that, because you're not showing up as a speaker for me at the moment. So I think that might be the best thing to do. And just if we can let's try and get that sorted out while we carry on talking with Dom now. So because of course we do want to hear from you and hear about your reports on Ukraine's statues wars later. So that would be my recommendation, is if you drop out of the call now and try and rejoin with the DM that should be in the invitation that should be in your DMs on your phone. So thank you very much, Colin. Dom Nichols, can I ask you just to comment on this intelligence update from the British MOD? I'm just going to read it out now. General Colonel Mikhail Teplinsky has likely been dismissed as one of Russia's key operational commanders in Ukraine. He was the officer on the ground in charge of the withdrawal from the west of the Dnipro in November last year, and he had received praise in Russia as a capable and pragmatic commander. And I mean, for us in the newsroom, it seems just another name, another Russian commander on the merry-go-round of gaining commands and losing them. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think it is part of the merry-go-round. I mean, the Russian generals and senior officers in field combat commands in Ukraine seem to last less time than a Premiership football manager. I mean, they don't have any time at all to demonstrate success or a path to success. Putin seems to demand success immediately, and if you don't, then you're off. So seemingly when he was put into command, so General Surovikin, when he went into command, it seemed like one of the first things he was able to do was convince Putin of the need for Russian forces to get out of Kherson, get across the Dnipro River and consolidate what they've got on the south bank, on the left bank of the Dnipro. And that's what they did. We were somewhat surprised at that, because Russia has not shown a willingness to do the sensible military thing and move back to consolidate positions when they were losing. And we were also surprised at the time that there was no heads rolled. Now, maybe this is it. This guy who's sacked today, forgive me, I haven't got his name right in front of me, but he's in charge of the VDV units, the Russian airborne forces, and seemingly they were so they were down in Kherson. They were brought out first. A lot of the people that stayed behind, we think, were the mobilised troops, but they got the airborne forces, who are much better trained troops and we think equipped troops, got them out first, and then redeployed them up into the Donbass. And it looks as if now there's the head rolling for that. And it speaks of, again, this turmoil at the top in the chain of command, where you had Surovikin and Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group. They seemed to be in the ascendancy until just a couple of weeks ago, when Defense Minister Shoigu and the head of Russia's armed forces, General Valery Gerasimov, were put in charge of the war as well. So Gerasimov is in charge of the whole of Russia's armed forces. He's now also in charge of the day-to-day running of the war. That is not a very sensible command and control construct, because he's busy running the whole of the armed forces. Give him another day job of running the war. That's very tricky. So it speaks of a little bit of turmoil at the very top of the Russian chain of command. Of course, people are moved in and out of command occasionally if it's required. I mean, it's not. You'd be stupid just to hang on to people the whole time. People leave for all sorts of reasons: battlefield performance, injury, death, so on and so forth. And you find that some people who are very, very good at building a force and creating and training an armed force then might not be very good at leading them into battle. For example, Clausewitz, the old fellow himself, was supposedly very, very good at writing all this stuff down, but not actually very good at inspiring troops and they'll blood and thunder, speaking from the guts and getting them up and out, running at the enemy type thing. So it's not uncommon to a very different style of leadership that can work in an organisation in peacetime or even training in a combat setting, cannot then lead those troops in combat. So of course you do get a little bit of shuffling, but there's been so much of it with Russia's command that it is surprising, and it speaks of a real political meddling. And that is not good at all. Very generally, of course, there's overlap, but very generally, the politicians should be looking up and out. They should be trying to work the international arena, keep the allies on side, get the money, get the long lead items of diplomatic support and so on and so forth. And they should give the room for a senior military commander just to get on with running the war and not be having to look over their shoulder at the political context. So it seems as if Ukraine are much better able to do that with the split between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. Very clear roles, and they obviously interact probably on a daily basis, but they don't really seem to step into each other's sort of half of the pitch type thing. Very, very different model seemingly on Russia's side, where there's huge political interference and a lot of military decisions are made for political effect, or with one eye to will the boss like this decision, rather than what is going to be the effect on the battlefield. So a really muddied command and control construct in Russia. And General Mark Carlton-Smith, former head of the British Army, he was one of the things he said. I worked for him briefly for a couple of years in headquarters. One of the things he said was the very first thing you do as a commander is sort out that command and control. Just work out who needs to be where, what type of capabilities you need, and who's in charge of those capabilities and how they all dock together. Get that bit right, which is literally on a bit of paper. So sit down, scratch your head, draw it out on a bit of paper. Get that bit right, and then go and fight the war. If you don't get that right, the command and control, then the rest of it just falls apart, or you're really up against it. No matter how well trained, well equipped, and how much motivation the men and women at ground level have to try and take it to the enemy, if the construct is not there and that organisation, that fundamental underpinning is not there, it will eventually come a cropper. And I think that's what we've seen with Russia over the last nearly a year now. And it's just carrying on. They don't seem to have time to allow these people to get in and exert their powers of personality and their personal motivation on the situation. It's always going to be difficult. Of course, when you're put into command in war, you can practice as much as you like, do as many exercises as you like. It's going to be different when it is actually a shooting match. But they just don't seem to be given the time to make those adjustments, those personal adjustments to their style of leadership. And I think this just continues that motion. And I think we're going to see more of it, that the very heavy hand from Moscow really meddling down into very tactical levels in this war in Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom Nichols. Let's go to Colin Freeman, who I think is on the call now. Thank you so much for joining us, Colin. You've written an absolutely fascinating piece that is on the Telegraph website. If listeners want to go and read it, it's called "The Ukrainian Culture Warriors Tearing Russian Statues Down." Colin, you've spoken to some of these activists who are as you've written, tearing Russian statues down, taking them off their pedestals. Who did you speak to, and what are they doing?
Yes, so I spoke to an activist in Kiev when I was there just before Christmas called Oleg Slabospitsky. I apologize if I've mangled his name. And what he does is he goes around Kiev trying to de-Russify the place, as he puts it. So he targets any streets where there are Russian the streets that have their names that honour Russia or the Soviet Union, and also organises flash mobs that do up graffiti on statues of Soviet generals and other sort of politicians and literary figures and so on. Basically, anybody that reminds Ukrainians of Russia. Now, this is typically people from the Soviet period, your Lenins and so on, and people who were regarded as communist overlords, but also people from the Tsarist period as well. Given that many Ukrainians regard the period of Soviet rule really as simply being an extension of the centuries of Tsarist colonization that Ukraine underwent before then.
And did you get a sense from him of what he and his activists are putting in their place, or is the focus at the moment very much, as you say, the de-Russification, that they're taking away of the statues, the dismantling of the statues, the taking away of the Russian names? Have they thought much about what they're changing them to?
They have, yes. Sometimes it's just simply removing large Russian statues, but a lot of the street names that they're getting, that they want changed, they have suggestions for Ukrainian cultural figures to be put up instead, streets named after Ukrainian poets or writers, many of whom, according to this activist, are somewhat overlooked in Ukraine's general cultural scene, again as a result of the years of domination during the Soviet period, where Russian-speaking figures and figures from Moscow were often given pride of place. So that there's quite a few Ukrainian cultural and literary figures that are coming up. There's also, of course, plans to rename quite a lot of the streets after fallen heroes from the current war, of which there are no shortage.
That's absolutely fascinating. Did you get any sense from him that there's any pushback or resistance to what they're doing in Kyiv, or is the population very much on side?
Generally, I sense that the population is pretty on side. You have to remember that, we think of statue wars as being a Western thing. This part of the world, the former Soviet Union, in a way wrote the book on statue wars after the fall of communism, when, as we all remember, when the Berlin Wall fell, lots of statues of Stalin and Lenin being taken down. However, that process apparently was much more marked in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. In Ukraine, which was rather more heavily under the Soviet footprint, the Moscow footprint, and a lot of the leaders were a little bit more Soviet-leaning and been brought up in that school of thought. They weren't Václav Havels of the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia as it was then. They tended, the statues of Lenin and so on tended to be left there. But then when Ukraine had its Maidan revolution, its pro-Western revolution in 2014, there was a renewed campaign then of so-called decommunization, which I think was an attempt to just rid themselves of the vestiges of the Soviet period, again to kind of rid themselves of those legacies of Russian rule. That campaign, I think, attracted broad support, certainly in the pro-Western areas of Ukraine, less so in the pro-Russian areas, of course, in the east. But then after the current invasion began last year, the campaign has gained a great deal of momentum. And also earlier this, I think in at the end of April, in the wake of all the atrocities in places like being discovered in places like Bucha and Irpin, a new campaign also gained momentum called Pushkin Fall. I think modelled perhaps on the Roads Must Fall campaign in the West, which was against the Russian poet Pushkin, who was regarded as a sort of Russian Shakespeare and very much the father of Russian culture and Russia's very grand literary tradition. And lots of statues of Pushkin started getting taken down. These are all over Ukraine, as indeed they are over Russia and many other parts of the world. It's kind of a Russian global cultural token, if you like. The Ukrainian view was that Pushkin was, these statues were being used as a sort of cultural marker by the Russians, that this was anywhere that had a statue of Pushkin was essentially legitimate Russian, a legitimate part of the Russian world, and therefore, someone like Vladimir Putin would be entitled to exercise his rule there. They also said that Pushkin was an unabashed Russian imperialist, which, if you read some of his lines, where he rails against people who slander Russia, he probably was, but to some extent he was probably just aping the political outlooks of the day, just as we get some of our own great cultural figures from the past tended to have imperialist views that we find in Britain are a bit problematic these days. This is where it gets a bit difficult, because there are those who say, look, it's one thing to remove statues of Soviet generals or statues of Lenin or Stalin or whatever. It's a bit different to remove statues of somebody like Pushkin, because what Pushkin gave was perhaps more than just an imperialist view of Russia. He gave culture, he gave he bequeathed a great literary tradition, and he also apparently was a champion of many Ukrainian literary figures during his time. However, the Ukrainians kind of reject this at the moment, or certainly the ones I've spoken to, and I should stress that I haven't spoken to everybody. There's a multiplicity of views on this very sensitive subject, but a lot of them say, well, look, I'm sorry about that, but in the wake of what happened in Bucha, we don't really want any Russian-speaking, Russian literary figures on our streets at the moment in the form of street names or statues, especially when, like Pushkin, we think they are used as a kind of a marker to mark this out as being part of Moscow's sphere of influence. That doesn't make us feel comfortable. That makes us feel vulnerable, and frankly, we don't like them. And one guy even said to me, look, even if Pushkin's statues were not used in this fashion, the fact is that he's a Russian-speaking poet, and I'm not really in the mood for hearing about Russian-speaking poets at the moment. He used the analogy of Britain in World War II. He said, would you expect Britons to be reading verse by Goethe, the German poet, or expect to have statues of Wagner up during World War I or World War II? And I expect the answer to that is probably no.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Colin, for sort of talking us through some of the views of the people you've spoken to. I mean, one thing maybe to be good to hear you touch on is how this isn't taking place in a vacuum. Of course, there's a broad trend of de-Russification in Ukraine. I mean, we've spoken to many Ukrainians about this, and part of it is language, and many Ukrainians feeling that actually now they'd much rather speak Ukrainian than Russian, even if they are Russian speakers. Could you talk a little bit about that? Put this Pushkin Fall into sort of cultural context for us.
Yes. Again, this has been a movement that's been ongoing, I think, really since independence in 1991, the move towards rediscovering Ukrainian as a language, partly just, a sort of a typical post-independence move to rediscover a nation's cultural roots and so on. Again, I think it gained ground after the Orange Revolution in 2004 and again in 2014. And it's gained further ground now. I've met quite a few Ukrainians who say they only really want to speak Ukrainian now, and they don't really want to learn Russian anymore. Obviously, if you envisage that happening in a country where it's previously been bilingual in many parts, there was a potential worry there that you might be sowing division between those who want to only speak Ukrainian and those certainly in the Russian-speaking areas, or who would prefer not to perhaps be coerced into only speaking Russian. This has proved a flashpoint in the past. One of the reasons that the separatists in eastern Ukraine were able to rile people up in 2014 was because of moves to restrict the use of Russian as an official language in that area by the Kiev government. So you can see it perhaps becoming a bit of a flashpoint. One linguistic expert I spoke to said he'd actually conducted his own experiment, social experiment on the streets of Kiev. He'd gone out, he'd spoken to a number of people in Russian just to see if they would insist on speaking in Ukrainian to him. I think he perhaps targeted people who he suspected would prefer to speak just Ukrainian. And at no point did he say that anybody was rude to him or said, "Look, I'm sorry, I only speak Ukrainian." So he doubted it would be a flashpoint of any kind. I should stress I'm not an expert on this, so I can't verify what else he told me, which was that most people can, after 30 years in which Ukrainian has been taught in schools as well, he said most people, can switch relatively easily from one to another. So he didn't see too much of an issue with that. And certainly a lot of Ukrainians talk of this in a positive fashion. It's about rediscovering their own cultural identity and promoting that, not trying to deny anybody else their identity.
Thanks, Colin. Dom, I believe you've got a question.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Colin. Lovely to hear from you. Just a quickie, if I may. From your experience of working in other parts of the world, Africa especially, can you project forward where this sort of these attacks on culture can go? It's one thing to say, yeah, we're not denying all Russian culture, but now's not the time. We're just not in the mood to sort of split hairs between who are the good and the bad poets, for example. I mean, that they can very rapidly turn into entrenched positions. And just like I say, from your experience, can you project where this might go? And is it always good? Do people come back to appreciating the other side in some way?
That I think is quite hard to say. I think it's true that in countries that have had and this is a massive generalization, but in countries I've visited that have had a rather happier or smoother transition from the colonial period, and where the problems associated with leaving, ending a period of colonization are now receding into the distance. There is sometimes a more relaxed attitude about the legacies of the colonial past. They're sometimes seen as, but some people are perhaps more disposed to see the benefits, and they're also sometimes disposed to sort of laugh at it a bit. It's something they can treat with a bit of humour. I think in countries, in many parts of Africa, for example, where these issues are still felt more keenly, and life is the transition has not been so easy. People are not in quite such a mood to take benign points of view on it. Although everywhere I've ever been around the world, I've encountered unfashionably pro-imperialist views as well. I've been to many places where people have said, "Oh, it would be better if you British were still running things, or you British still, did quite well when you were here, even though we wouldn't want you anymore." Which is not a view that I think you would hear many British people expressing these days. Not particularly widespread, but it is surprising sometimes when you hear that when you hear that said.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. It's really good to hear you again, and thank you for coming on. We're going to start to wrap up, I think. But Dom, we did have a question from a listener I thought would be quite interesting for you to respond to. So let me just get it up. I really should have had this up before doing this. Let me just find it. It's a question about tanks. This is from Elizabeth. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, for sending this in. This is around the tank delivery to Ukraine. She asks, a technical question for Dom. The Russian tanks were taken out pretty easily by the Ukrainians. Why would the Leopards not be taken out similarly by the Russians? I think there's quite a lot to unpack there. Please go for it.
Yeah, there is. I'll try and be brief because of time, and we do need to do another look at kind of what tanks are, and especially what they're not. But this links to it in some way. Elizabeth, thanks for the question. So basically, tanks are, as I've said before, tanks are seen as the most efficient way of balancing three competing requirements on the battlefield. So that's mobility, firepower, and protection. Mobility being able to go, well, ideally everywhere, although even tracks can't get you everywhere. Firepower, having a great big gun, and protection, being able to take a punch and keep going. Now, traditionally, tanks are going to be moving forwards towards enemy positions. If you think of the sort of old days of lines, which is kind of where the war in Ukraine is getting to now, with these fixed lines, very fixed lines, so you know where the enemy are and you drive towards them. Because tanks can't move if they are absolutely covered in armour from every direction, sides and the back and the belly and the top, covered in armour to take that punch. The armour on a tank, the really thick stuff, is in the frontal 60-degree arc. So if you stood on a turret, if the turret was pointing over the front of the tank, pointing towards the enemy, if you held your arms out at 60 degrees in front of you, that's where the armour is. So in front of the turret and on front of the hull and down the sort of first third, if you like, of the hull as well. So the armour on tank is thin on the sides, at the back, on the belly, and the top. So those areas are always vulnerable. Now, if you have a 360-degree battlefield, which is especially so in an urban setting where people can get into tower blocks and fire down on you, or go through the sewers and the underground systems and come up underneath you, or it's very easy to hide around corners and so on and so forth, then you can hit tanks in these really vulnerable areas. Now, that's not to say that you'll kill everybody inside. You might just blow the tracks off. You might blow the engine up. It might not be able to move. Might still be able to use its gun. So even though it can't move somewhere, it's still quite a potent thing. Or you might have knocked the gun out as well. But like I say, you don't always kill all the crew inside. But tanks, like I say, are not impervious from all angles. And the more that you have a very fluid environment, and not these static lines that you can race towards, just pointing your really armoured bits at the enemy, then the more vulnerable you are. Add to that the fact that the vast majority of the tanks that Russia has put in the field here, the T-72s, are quite old, so their armour is not especially thick. Nothing like the armour in terms of the technical ability to withstand a hit that the Western tanks have. So the Russian tanks are older, and they have these things on them that you'll see, these boxes, almost sort of shoebox size things called ERA. That's explosive reactive armour. These are literally two bits of metal. Well, not literally, but essentially two bits of metal with an explosive charge in between them. So a round comes in towards the tank to try and hit the tank. It hits that explosive reactive armour. The charge goes off inside the box and physically pushes the upper plate away. So it tries to push the incoming round away from the tank and protect the tank that way. Now, modern anti-tank weapons like the US Javelin have dual warheads. So they've got two warheads on the missile. So the first warhead sets off the ERA, and the second warhead then goes against the tank itself, which, as I said, quite old. The steel isn't very thick, and it can go straight through. Allied to that, of course, we've seen a lot of this ERA just hasn't worked because a lot of it's old, it hasn't been maintained properly, it doesn't work, it's been sold off. There's long known corruption in the Russian logistics system. So a lot of the tanks that we see knocked out on the battlefield, you'll still see the ERA completely intact, whereas if it had worked properly, that would not be there. It would have exploded. It looks a right mess, but the tank survives and the crew survive is the main point. So that largely it's Russia's got older tanks. They are not working as they should do with the ERA, and also it's very rarely now a static battlefield where you're able to point your main bit of armour towards the enemy, because they can hit you around the sides, around the back. We saw that when Russia tried to go into Kyiv in the first few weeks. These these packs of Ukrainian infantry that were going around with anti-tank weapons. They were able, I mean, it takes great guts to do it, to sneak around the back of a tank formation and hit them from the bum. Like I say, it might not knock out the entire tank, it might not kill the crew inside, but it's not going to go anywhere if the engine's blown up and the tracks have come off it and so on and so forth. So, tanks are very, very vulnerable at the best of times. The battlefield is a real dangerous place. If you're able to use tanks protected by infantry, with or without infantry personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, but if you're able to protect tanks, then they can bring the mobility and the firepower part of that holy trinity to bear. But when it comes to the protection, the frontal arc is very good, but elsewhere they are still extremely vulnerable. I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you, Dom. And just to add to that, I mean, Dom, as you said, tanks are still incredibly dangerous, even if they're sort of disabled. I mean, I was told of one incident in this war where a Russian tank had its tracks blown off. The gunners inside panicked and started shooting in all different directions because they weren't sure where the incoming fire was coming from, and all hell was let loose by that. So absolutely, it's not just a matter of tanks can be incredibly dangerous even if damaged. So thank you, Dom, for your answer. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your question. I feel like we've reached the end of our time here today together. So thank you, Dom. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Venetia. Can I just have your final thoughts? Dom, why don't you go first? What will you be looking to over the next few days?
Well, two things. Got to keep an eye on the tank debate with Germany. We've done that one to death. Secondly, I mentioned in today's newsletter, if you sign up for Telegraph Dispatch's newsletter, Tuesdays and Thursdays have the foreign newsletter. Tuesdays is always Ukraine. I make the point today about South Africa. Lavrov's down there at the moment, courting South Africa. Long-standing ties between South Africa and the USSR, now Russia. Really interesting story from late December, only really coming to light now, of a container ship that's owned by a Russian firm, that is sanctioned, that turned its AIS transponder off, so didn't know where it was going, came into port in South Africa, not a commercial port as you'd expect a freighter to go to, went to the local naval facility, unloaded suspiciously at night over 3 days, with the stuff that was taken off led away in trucks with armed military escorts. So quite what the hell was going on there, we do not know. We think possibly this was Russian supply of ammunition to South African special forces fighting in Mozambique. What they're getting in return, we don't know, but it just shows that this diplomatic front, we're very focused on the battlefield, of course we are, and the politics in Europe at the moment, but the wider diplomatic front of trying to court those parts of the world who are ambivalent or at best, or actually side with Russia because of long-standing ties or business or what have you, economics. It's very interesting to see what's happening on the diplomatic front, because if the UN has a greater role to say in what happens here, then it's those other countries in the General Assembly, all of whom have a vote, that if they've been courted by Russia, then you can see the peril that could cause. So just a spotlight on South Africa because of Lavrov's visit there right now, but just sort of highlights this wider diplomatic front to this war.
Thanks, Dom. And I believe part of that was highlighted by a listener writing in. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Am I right in saying that, Dom? Just to make sure I'm...
Yeah, Stuart, many thanks for pointing me towards that story from South Africa, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Colin Freeman, what are your final thoughts?
Just to add, having talked about activists removing street signs and daubing statues with graffiti and so on, I should just also point out that the activists I interviewed in Kiev who want to prosecute this de-Russia campaign, by which I mean who want to de-Russify stuff, they are keen that it is not actually done by activist mobs. They want due procedure in place, which is something that they regard as being part of a democratic society, i.e. they want all these statues removed by city council votes and therefore debates and so on. And Kiev City Council has actually already, I think, earmarked about 40 streets and monuments for either for renaming or for dismantling, etc., etc. As with all these sorts of culture war debates, if you want to use that expression, there is a lot of nuance in it, and there are no real right answers one way or the other. Although I should point out that I've had this discussion once or twice with quite a lot of Ukrainians when I've been in Ukraine, where occasionally they talk about promoting the Ukrainian language or whatever, and sometimes you want to say, well, you don't want to become too stridently anti-Russian. Your war is with the Russian government and so on. And sometimes that is acknowledged. You do sometimes though feel the strength of feeling, I think, that is directed not just at the Russian government now, but also to some extent perhaps at those large elements of the Russian population that appear to support the war. And I guess that just demonstrates this is what war does to you. And certainly as a foreigner who can scuttle back out of Ukraine, back to his comfortable home in the UK at any point, I think I don't really feel I have much to say by way of riposte to that.
Thanks, David, and the rest of the team. This is Francis in one of the other studios here at The Telegraph. On Ukraine the Latest, we often find ourselves examining the role of Putin's disinformation campaigns within Russia and abroad, and how the West can battle against them. To dive deeper into this, I interviewed Dr Ivana Stradner, a former visiting scholar at Harvard and now a research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C., to discuss the effectiveness of information warfare and Western countermeasures. We also looked at a region that has been under-discussed on the podcast so far, the Balkans, and Russia's role in destabilising that region, where volatility can often spill over into the rest of the European continent. This is our conversation. Thank you very much for joining us, Ivana. Just starting us off, some analysts believe that the West can only have a minimal impact in cutting through to the Russian people about the war being conducted in their name and the consequences for them personally. You, however, are more optimistic as to what can be achieved. So, in your view, how can the West do more to win the psychological and informational battle within Russia itself?
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I don't know whether I'm more optimistic or not, but I think that we have no other choice than to try to penetrate inside Russian information system. And this is precisely why. So for many, many years, Washington has been inside the Russian information system selling Russians on the American dream, telling them about our democracy here, about the benefits of modern art, about Hollywood movies, just name it. This is really nothing new. This is the relic of the Cold War. But something like that will not be helpful these days because the rise of nationalism is so high inside Russia. So we have to actually alter our messages. And the best way, really, instead of selling Russians on the American dream, we should sell them the Russian dream that benefits and suits our interests. So the reason why I emphasize that we should actually try to go inside the Russian information system is not because I do believe that suddenly a lot of Russians will be in the street protesting against Putin aggression in Ukraine, but rather because we need to make Russian intelligence spend their time, energy, and resources that benefit us from to defend themselves from our information operations. And the reason why I emphasize this is because the rise of nationalism is extremely important. There is this belief that the Russians, they want to live in the great, better Russian world. And unfortunately, today, more than 75% of people inside Russia actually do not appreciate the United States. But that rise of nationalism can actually be an asset for us. And when I talk for us, I don't only mean, for the US, but also the UK and our ally. And I think we need to send them messages that will resonate with the Russian people. Like, for example, the Russian people are very proud of their country. And we need to actually target those far-right groups and to tell them that Russia could have been the great power and that Russia could have been the great Russia if it was not Putin who destroyed Russian reputation. So that's one of the messages. The second thing is, I always like to say that the Russian people, they cultivated this whole thing of a strongman image inside Russia. and you will see like Vladimir Putin always looking good on pictures and riding all those, animals and swimming in cold water. And that's relevant because if we go back all the way, to the Cold War, Russian people were punished for questioning nationalism. And this is, why I think we need to spread those messages. And I like to always say that humor can be immensely powerful tool because we should put Russia always on the defensive, never to, every time when they spread disinformation campaign like that, we have to say they're wrong. On the contrary, the Russian people have a very, very good sense of humor and they like to make jokes of their own leaders historically. And let's help them. I always like to use my favorite example of Stalin, because right now what's unfortunately happening in Russia, Stalin has a tremendously important role. And United Kingdom, actually there was this famous movie, The Death of Stalin, that Russia actually accused the United Kingdom of an intelligence, for creating information operations that degraded like a Russian greatness. So they banned that movie. No, let's do that again. Let's, make similar movies. Let's make memes and put it like in Russian information space. They will really, really, really dislike something like that. As I said, I'm not very optimistic that something like that can help Russia suddenly become democracy because we abandoned information operations after the end of the Cold War. So first thing what we need to do our info ops and psychological warfare to neutralize the nationalist and to pollute the information space. And then maybe, one day to create new narratives. I want to always emphasize one tremendously important thing is when people in the West talk about psychological information operations, they talk about some random propaganda, some disinformation. No, we are in the middle of information war with Russia. And we need to think like in the way that Kremlin thinks about this. So in 2021, Russia adopted a new national security strategy, and for the first time, we devoted a special chapter on information operations. And it's fascinating to see that because Russia has historically had this paranoia that the West is actually using information operations inside Russia. So they always, claim that we are going after their youth to spread, our values that are not in alignment with Russian moral and spiritual values. And actually, a few weeks ago, Shoigu openly stated that we are waging a psychological war. And the only thing that I have to say about that, if only. So all those things, when you read all those documents can be very helpful to understand how they think about information warfare. And if we want to counter that, we need to think like them. I'm not saying that we should ever spread disinformation because the truth is on our side, but we do need to understand that even their military values, 4-to-1 military measures and non-military to military measures. So if they think that this is so relevant, then it should be, relevant for us, because one thing that I can guarantee you that Russia will not roll on tanks in London or Washington, but that what they will continue to do to use asymmetric opportunities to polarize our countries, to sow chaos inside, both inside United Kingdom and United States and European Union and elsewhere.
Fascinating. I was very struck also when you were talking about the Soviet humour. It just reminded me of Ronald Reagan's speeches during the Cold War. And apparently those were real Soviet jokes, which of course speaks to what your point is that actually there is a sort of black humour in Russia, which we don't really hear very much of. Just staying on this point about effective propaganda in Russia, or perhaps not the propaganda, but effective messaging, should I say, to clarify my point, effective messaging within Russia. Arnold Schwarzenegger did that really interesting video early on in the war where he, I think, did a little bit of what you were saying, which is that he sort of appealed to the Russian character, Russian pride. And that really went viral all over the internet. And I'm just wondering whether you think that's an example of what the West should be doing more of.
First of all, I was so happy when you mentioned Reagan, because looking back, at all those videos where he was making all those jokes. I mean, he even made a joke that was later, leaked on the radio, something along those lines. Lines like, "Dear fellow Americans, we are going to start bombing Russia like in 5 minutes." And that really tells you everything you need to know how back then people didn't fear Moscow regardless of their nuclear threats. And nowadays, one of the reasons why people are afraid to use offensive information operations is because they do not want to provoke Russia. They do not want to provoke Putin, which is absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, they already think that we are doing that, so we should be doing that. In terms of Schwarzenegger video, I saw that video first time on Twitter, and it conveyed a very beautiful message addressing the Russian people alike, and it had a subtitle in Russian. Everything was fine, except for the fact that back then, 3% of the Russians used Twitter. And only after they put in the Russian information space, Telegram and in a few other places. However, that video is something what we would probably do during the Cold War back then. Nowadays, such messages will not resonate within a Russian, because all people who are pro-Western, they already know these things, and the far-right groups, they consider, such messages coming from foreign agents. What we need to think about putting those messages through their people, through people who have trust, within those groups. And I cannot emphasize enough, how much I wish that the United States and our allies actually provided more opportunities to the Russian people, to give them every possible platform to address the Russians speaking not only their language, but their culture, who can, spread those messages again. Look, I'm not optimistic, and I have to emphasize this, that any of such information operations will end the war. But I do believe that it will irritate the Kremlin a lot. And that will actually make Russian intelligence spend more time on protecting their own information space instead of attacking us.
Funneling those resources that they'd otherwise be using for disinformation purposes themselves, just using it to try and counter Western narratives. Yes. Just staying on this topic, it's so interesting hearing your perspective on all of this. Do you think in the modern age, this sort of, when I was growing up, the internet was talked about as this great liberational force, and that regardless of what one was trying to do on the internet, that by its very character, the medium is the message, we would all be in some way liberated by this. Do you think it is easier or harder to control hearts and minds in the internet age, particularly in a country like Russia that has so much control over the internet?
It is extremely difficult because, look, back then we were able, for example, to send Dr. Zhivago inside Russia, or to use American modern art, or a Jackson Pollock who traveled, across Eastern Europe, to tell people like my family what it means actually to have liberal values. Nowadays, it's extremely difficult because we are fighting against democracy, we are fighting authoritarian regime, and Russia believes in internet sovereignty. So they completely, shut down their information space. It is nowadays, if you use the word war instead of special military operation, you can end up in war. And, in 2022, everyone was so appalled, that Russia suddenly, decided not to allow the use of Twitter or Facebook. This is nothing new because Putin has been working on this for years. And he actually even had a legislation a few years ago where he would punish all those social media platforms who would not comply, with the Kremlin's view, allegedly saying, they were posting something related, let's say, to child pornography. And there is nothing more the authoritarian systems fear than the freedom of thought and the ideas. And this is why they're afraid of having a free information space. So it is extremely difficult to do it, but it's not impossible. And it's much easier, for a authoritarian system to spread their disinformation campaigns here. And this is why I cannot emphasize enough that we need to stop talking about Russian disinformation as some random propaganda. This is an information warfare tool. And if you go and read the definition of information warfare in Russian Ministry of Defense website, They are openly talking about using all those, psychological operations tool to to polarize people. So this is really, nothing new. And it's challenging, but it's not impossible. The problem is, that nowadays a lot of people live in a very risk-averse world when it comes to bombs. People are afraid to do these things because to do it, you need to nowadays be a little bit more edgy and to put some controversial information. And people are afraid to do these things. And plus, you have social media platforms that just recently shut down American DoD and authentic accounts. So there are so many challenges, but the sooner we understand those challenges and have courage to overcome those obstacles, the easier it will be to counter Russia. Because one thing I will tell you, Russia might be losing on the ground in Ukraine, but Russia is not losing in information space.
It's interesting you say that, because that was actually going to be my next question, which is that the conventional narrative is that Russian propaganda, obviously once considered the most effective in the world, has arguably largely failed in the war it's waged online and elsewhere, at least in the early months of the war. I just wondered whether you agreed with that analysis.
I firmly disagree with that analysis. And this is why. Who stated that? Scholars and policymakers and people on Twitter? Or people in Africa or Venezuela, for example? Because the world does not revolve around Brussels, London, or Washington, D.C., with all due respect. And people on Twitter might not believe that monkeypox was created by CIA or our Department of Defense, which is exactly what the Ministry of Defense claimed, that we developed monkeypox in one of our biolabs. That's what they openly claimed just a few months ago. So people, like you and me might not believe in that thing, but I can guarantee you that people in Africa firmly believe that the food crisis stemmed from the US, that the United States is responsible for this war because allegedly we are waging a proxy war. They do believe in the role of biolabs. So the information space is very wide, and Russia is not only targeting the United States, Russia is targeting everywhere possible to create chaos in places such as Africa, where information operations have been on a constant over the past decade, let alone what Russia is doing in places such as Venezuela or Asia, using their RT or Sputnik, inauthentic accounts like bloggers or for example, agents of influence, social media influencers. It's a very, very wide space with numerous tools that Russia has at its disposal to discredit the West. And look, this is nothing new, because even during the Cold War, I always love to use this example, and this is one of my favorite disinformation campaigns, and I'll tell you why. When during the Cold War, actually, Russia was spreading disinformation that the United States, it was called Operation Denver, that we developed HIV, that CIA actually developed HIV specifically to target Black people and use that as an ethnic weapon. So I'll just give you a very concrete example how it works nowadays. The messages are very similar. What is the difference? The difference is the media space, that now with social media you can spread such disinformation super easy. So, for example, the Russian government openly claims that we used bioweapons specifically to target the Slavic people. They openly stated that. Then the second thing is, for example, they claim that we developed bioweapons where we use actually migratory birds to deliver such bioweapons, and then they became a little bit more tech advanced, so they accused us of using drones. And I just use one very concrete example. There are numerous examples like that are unfortunately very much believable, in the West. And what should we do about this? I do not actually think that we should counter that information by saying, Russia is lying. If I had any opportunity to do this, I would, for example, declassify documents from Russian from Russian biolabs programs, even during the Cold War, and to tell the truth about, for example, Russian games with maybe smallpox, and to put Russia on the defensive in the information space. I would make, humorous and funny memes, and to use that to tell the truth to every of those places that I just mentioned where such information operations actually work. So we do have tools. The problem is whether we have courage to do it in the way that we did during the Cold War.
I think it's been interesting as well seeing how, since the war started, some of the intelligence services, at least I'm specifically talking about the British ones, have been more open in certain information spaces than they would normally be. They've been commenting on Russia. They've been saying after the fact, or sometimes before the fact, what they believe Russia is about to do. That would never have happened during the Cold War. They've made much more open. And I think that's them trying to adapt their strategy in order to, I think there was even a term that was used that was sort of pre-assuming what Russia was going to do next in this space. And that's something new. So just wondered if you could comment on the manner in which, and maybe you don't think they're doing enough, the intelligence services in the West have tried to counteract and adapt to this new style of warfare.
So to begin with, a lot of those influence operations are covert, so I have no idea what's happening. However, one thing that I can tell you exactly what you said, whenever, we see Russian narratives, it is, so the way the Russian military operates, they use information operations as a prelude to their kinetic use of force oftentimes. And even though some of them can be lies, they might set actually informational conditions for their next moves, which is exactly what the UK understood very, very well last year. And they put forward a narrative of taking away that opportunity from Russia to use that to justify the use of force, which was extremely brave. Like, I was so impressed when the UK did it. And but UK, also understands very, very well Russian mentality and culture and the decision-making processes over there. So they really know how to target Russia in a way that it can really hurt them. And Russia hates that more than anything else. So the UK did a proper thing, I think, using that. And I see more and more like a UK, British statements on Russia's next moves. And I'm glad, that the United Kingdom does not defend, itself, like from debunking every single lie that Russia is saying about UK. And we already, discussed about Russian influence operations inside the United Kingdom. So this is a perfect way to put Russia on the defensive. So they should defend themselves from us.
We've talked about Africa and made a reference to some of the Central Asian states and the disinformation campaigns that Russia is doing there. You're also a keen observer of the Balkans, somewhere that we've perhaps not discussed on the podcast as much. To those who know little about the region, what's happening there at the moment in this space, and what's Russia's role in trying to destabilize the region?
So the Balkans has not been on the agenda of the West for at least 2 decades. And European Union has been trying, to put the Balkans on this European Union path. But one thing that they failed to do is that they did not pay attention to Russian operations there. And whoever thinks that this whole thing with Ukraine, that the aggression in Ukraine is just a novel thing, is sorely mistaken, because it has been going on for almost a decade. And the Balkans was also part, just like everything that has been happening in Georgia or Armenia. It's part of a big picture, for Russia. So Russia has been investing tremendous resources in Serbia, in Republika Srpska, in Montenegro, to sow chaos in the region. Russia does not care to occupy the Balkans, but they're looking for a new space to sow chaos. So the West pays more attention to the Balkans instead of Ukraine.
As they did in Syria, one could argue as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's absolutely the same strategy. And what Putin is really trying to do, he is specifically targeting the far-right groups right now to install chaos in Kosovo. and to position himself as a mediator, and then to blackmail the West and tell them, there will not be like a peace without, me as a mediator. And then you have, of course, the Serbian president, who has also his own goals, who also benefits from those crises. Whenever there is like internal issue, he escalates the crisis, and then he de-escalates, and then, he is using that to negotiate for his own deals with the West. So it's a very complex situation. And the reason why I'm very, concerned is that I have never seen, so like Russia, for example, just recently opened RT. They've been operating Sputnik for many years in Belgrade. Telegram, Russian Telegram is going absolutely crazy about inflaming all those narratives regarding Kosovo. And of course, they blamed United States actually for opening a new front line to challenge Russia. So, look, Russia will not be able militarily to help Serbia. They cannot roll on tanks there or to send even jets. They sent lots of weapons in the past, even some of them are clearly useless. We see that in Ukraine. But what Russia will continue to do is to inflame this chaos in Kosovo, in Republika Srpska. And I'm also very concerned, about Montenegrin polarization there, to sow chaos. And then that we spend, time and energy on focusing on the Balkans and fixing situations there instead of focusing fully on Ukraine.
How bad do you think things could get in the Balkans in the years ahead? I mean, are we talking, serious enough for things to erupt into real serious violence, as we've seen in decades previously, or is this more destabilizing it within certain political confines?
So it's very difficult to predict, and I will tell you why. In 2021, in December, I was very much convinced that the Balkans will be next battlefield for Putin. It was the part of the game. The thing is, Ukraine clearly has shown that Russia is not such a power that Putin claims to be. So as long as Ukraine continues to win, the Balkans will not erupt in the conflict that we see that we saw during the 90s. As soon as Russia is over, also leaders in the Balkans will have no leverage to blackmail the West, which is a good thing. However, I also do not buy this argument that the situation in the Balkans has been resolved with the latest mediation. I am quite convinced that we might actually see new escalations in the region and a new pattern of escalating and then to de-escalating. So it is definitely something that the West should pay attention to, but not to allow to be distracted from Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Ivana, for a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.